Welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic today that you might not think of right away when you think about nuance and interpretation. We're talking about mathematics. But I think as a philosopher, you're going to find this pretty interesting. We're going to be looking at this idea of mathematical style.
Yeah, that's right. Even though we often think of math as this ultimate example of logic and objective truth, the way mathematicians actually go about, creating and reasoning and presenting their work, it's not all the same. There are these, distinct patterns, distinct approaches, and we can actually call those style. It's kind of like, a philosopher develops a unique way of building arguments or engaging with texts. Mathematicians, in a way, do something similar when they work.
For sure. And I think with your background in philosophy, you already get this idea that how we approach a subject can really shape how we understand it. So in this deep dive, we're going to look at how this idea of style, which we usually associate with art or literature, how that actually shows up in the world of mathematics. And we'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on mathematical style to help guide our conversation.
Yeah. We're going to kind of unpack these different ways that style has been used in mathematics. We'll look at things like broad cultural influences that might shape mathematical thinking, but we'll also zoom in on specific methodologies and problem-solving techniques. And ultimately, we want to think about, what does this even mean? What does the existence of mathematical style tell us about mathematical knowledge itself?
So to kick things off, I think it's interesting that mathematicians themselves were using this term style pretty early on. It wasn't just something historians or philosophers came up with later.
Yeah, you find it popping up early. Like in 1635, we've got Cavalieri, who was working with these indivisibilist techniques that he had. And he actually contrasts those with what he calls the Archimedean style. He even, and I'll try my best with the Latin here, "Scio autem praefata omnia ad stylum Archimedium reduci passi." Basically, all these things can be reduced to the Archimedean style. So even back then, people were recognizing there were different ways of doing mathematics, almost like different aesthetic preferences you might have.
So even way back then, they had this awareness that there are different approaches, and maybe some styles were seen as more, I don't know, rigorous or elegant than others. It's interesting to think that it wasn't just about getting to the right answer. There was something more to it.
Exactly. And then later, in 1701, we've got Leibniz. He makes this comment about how his own work, his analysis, does not differ from Archimedes' style except for the expressions, which are more direct and more appropriate to the art of discovery. He's pointing out a difference not just in how it's presented, but maybe even in how effective a method is for actually pushing math forward.
I find the timing here really interesting. The encyclopedia talks about how the term style in painting really starts to take off around the 1660s. Before that, the term was often manière. It makes you wonder, right? Because mathematicians seem to be using style in this more general sense around the same time, maybe even a bit earlier. It's not just a simple case of borrowing the idea from art.
You're totally right. It suggests that maybe mathematicians were recognizing these differences in their approaches on their own, driven by what was happening within math itself. And by the 19th century, you have people like Chasles. In 1837, he's talking about Monby, and he says, style, in fact, is so intimately welded to the spirit of a methodology that it must advance in step with it. So now style and the way you think and work in math are really intertwined.
And it keeps going into the 20th century, too. The encyclopedia mentions how, in 1980, Edwards was looking at Dedekind's work, and he was really impressed not just by the theorems themselves, but by Dedekind's whole style of mathematics, calling it inspiring. So it wasn't just about presentation style as something deeper that can influence mathematical thought for a long time.
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia makes a good point that style can mean so many things. You have the very personal styles of individual mathematicians. Euler, Ramanujan, Riemann, Serre, Wilde, they're all mentioned as having these, distinct styles that you can recognize. And then you have these broader categories, national styles or even epistemic styles. We're going to focus more on those broader categories today.
It makes sense. Trying to capture what makes one mathematician's style unique is a whole other challenge. So we've seen that mathematicians have been thinking about style for a long time. Let's move into how style has been used in these big, sweeping cultural histories of mathematics. It seems like looking at math through the lens of entire civilizations and historical periods.
Yeah, it gets pretty grand. Take Oswald Spengler. He wrote The Decline of the West in the early 20th century. And he had this, huge theory that the style of math that comes up in a culture is totally tied to that culture's overall spirit and its place in history. He made these big parallels between math ideas and artistic or architectural styles. Like he saw Euclidean geometry reflected in classical architecture and calculus connected to Gothic cathedrals even before those math ideas were fully developed.
So he's saying that math is like a cultural artifact, that it reflects these deeper trends in society. It's like math style is this unconscious expression of a culture's character. As a philosopher, it makes me think about the relationship between abstract thought and its historical context.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Spengler even went as far as saying that mathematics is basically an art form with its own styles and periods, just like painting or music. He even said, mathematics, then, is an art. As such, it has its styles and style periods.
And then there's Max Benz, who wrote Konturen einer Geistesgeschichte der Mathematik. He seemed to take a similar approach, linking style to this idea of essential form and the aesthetic that shapes our experience.
Right, Benz saw art and math as connected as part of this Geistesgeschichte, the history of mind or spirit. For him, style is form, essential form, and we designate this form as the aesthetic if it controls categorically the sensible, a material. He was really interested in finding parallels between math and art styles in different periods, like the Baroque and Romantic eras. But he was more careful than Spengler about just saying math style was the same as the art style of the time. He even mentioned Klein's Elementer Mathematik vom höheren Standpunkte aus as suggesting different styles within math itself.
These are really big theories, and it makes sense that people who are really into the details of math or art history might be skeptical. The encyclopedia mentions some skepticism towards these far-fetched parallels. And as a philosopher, I see how appealing these grand theories are, but it's hard to prove those connections for sure.
Right. Those theories offer a cool, unified picture, but the connections can feel a little, speculative. But the encyclopedia doesn't completely dismiss the idea of style in math. It suggests the concept might be more useful when it's linked more directly to how math is actually done. The work by Van Bendegem and Van Kerkhove is mentioned. They look at connections between literary and mathematical styles. It might be a more grounded approach.
So we're making a distinction between these really high-level uses of style to connect broad cultural trends and the more concrete applications of style to how math is actually practiced and written about.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia also points out that these grand theories sometimes mix up describing patterns, like just identifying them with trying to explain the psychological or sociological reasons behind those styles. Spengler and Benz lean more toward the grand parallel side.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit and talk about national styles in mathematics. This seems to be about describing math along national lines, sometimes without even mentioning art movements.
Right, this is a big topic, especially in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. People were thinking a lot about national identity then, just like there were discussions about national styles in science. Like German biology or American botany historians were trying to find French, German, or other national styles in math, too. Herbert Mertens, for example, did a lot of research on the differences between French and German mathematical styles.
And Mertens linked this to the debates between formalists or logicists on one side and intuitionists on the other. We often think of Hilbert and Poincaré as representing those different viewpoints, and they were really central to the foundational debates in math in the 1920s. So for our listener who might not be as familiar, the formalists, like Hilbert, really emphasized rigorous systems of symbols, while the intuitionists, led by Brouwer, thought math should be based on mental constructions.
Exactly. And at first, this debate wasn't really about national borders. For example, Felix Klein in Germany had a lot of intellectual connections with Poincaré in France. But then World War I happened, and it really made people think in terms of us versus them. Pierre Duhem, a French physicist and historian of science, really pushed this idea of contrasting French esprit de finesse, which is like an intuitive, flexible approach with German esprit de géométrie, this more rigorous, step-by-step way of doing math. He actually wrote, to start from clear principles, then to make progress step by step, patiently, painstakingly. This is what German genius excels at. The German esprit is essentially esprit de géométrie.
That definitely fed into the whole Krieg der Geister, the war of minds, where intellectual and scientific accomplishments were seen through this lens of national pride and competition.
Yeah, for sure. And while the French were using this kind of language to criticize what they saw as the overly abstract nature of German science, things took a really dark turn with the Deutsche Mathematik movement. This was during the Nazi era, and it was led by Ludwig Bieberbach. It's a scary example of how the idea of mathematical style can be twisted and used for terrible things.
Bieberbach, his work sounds awful, trying to link mathematical style to things like Volkstum, even blood and race. It's really disturbing to see these essentializing ideas applied to intellectual work.
It is. He was very clear about his goal. He wanted to show how those categories influenced the very style of how math was created. And of course, for someone who was aligned with the Nazis, that seemed like an obvious truth. He went on to compare mathematicians like Schmidt and Landau, Gauss, and Cauchy-Gorsat, trying to create this story of a special German math that was driven by intuition, as opposed to what he saw as a Jewish Latin math that focused on formalism. And he was using these really questionable psychological theories to back it up.
The encyclopedia actually quotes him saying that Landau's style was foreign to reality, antagonistic to life, inorganic. That is some really loaded language. It's frankly just repulsive.
It is. It shows how dangerous it is when these prejudiced ideas get into intellectual conversations. It's a reminder that we always have to be careful about politicizing and racializing knowledge.
The encyclopedia does say that modern historians who use the term national styles are very careful not to use it in this dangerous way. The focus is more on how local cultures can influence how knowledge develops and spreads.
Yeah, exactly. We see discussions about how there's a certain Russian style in fields like algebraic geometry and representation theory, or the well-studied Italian style in algebraic geometry during its golden age. And interestingly, the historian of mathematics, Angelo Bragalia, points out that the Italian school wasn't just about Italian mathematicians. It was more of a shared working style and a methodology, mostly based in Italy, but with people from other parts of the world also participating. So it's more complex than just national labels.
It seems like the terms we're using, schools, styles, methodologies, even images of mathematics, as scholars like Leo Corey, Amy DeHaan Delmedico, and Umberto Bottesini have suggested, are often used interchangeably. It shows how complicated these trends are.
Yeah, exactly. And unlike other fields like biology, where there might be clear frameworks for analyzing national style, in math, it's more context dependent. We have to be careful about oversimplifying things with national labels.
All right, so we've looked at these big historical and cultural perspectives, as well as this idea of national styles. What about the mathematicians themselves? Do they even recognize this concept of style in their own work and the work of others?
It's a good question. You can find mathematicians using the term style here and there, but they rarely talk about it systematically or in a lot of detail. Bierbach is a big exception, but his case is obviously very problematic. But there are some interesting examples.
Like Claude Chevallier's article from 1935, Variations du style mathématique. He doesn't seem to question whether style exists at all. He's more focused on the changes between 19th and 20th century math styles.
Right. Chevalier wasn't trying to come up with a super precise definition of style. He was using a specific example to show how maths went from what he called the Weierstrassian style of the 19th century to the axiomatic style that became really important in the 20th century.
And the Weierstrassian style, as he describes it, was all about being really rigorous in calculus, what he called the style of Eng, moving away from infinitesimals, which were more intuitive but sometimes less precise.
Exactly. The 19th century was a time when people were rethinking the foundations of math, and Weierstrass's definition of the limit was really important for making calculus more solid. Chevalier describes this style as having intensive and at times immoderate usage of the OL equipped with various indexes. And it involved using more inequalities than equalities in proofs, especially in areas like approximation theory. The goal was to rebuild all of analysis starting with a really strong foundation of real numbers.
So it seems like a very constructive foundational approach. Like they were trying to build math from the ground up, making sure every step was super rigorous. So what caused this shift away from the style of Urey towards the more abstract axiomatic method?
A few things happened. First, abstract algebraic theories like group theory came along. These theories were about structures that couldn't be easily built from real numbers in the same way as calculus. Second, defining certain math objects, like complex numbers, by constructing them from real numbers sometimes felt forced or artificial. And maybe most importantly, David Hilbert's axiomatic approach to geometry started to become really influential. In this approach, math objects are defined by the axioms they satisfy, not by explicitly constructing them. And this axiomatic thinking spread to other areas of math too, like Lebesgue integration, Fréchet's work on topological spaces, and Steinnitz's axiomatic treatment of fields.
And Chevalier saw this axiomatic style as changing how math was written and presented, emphasizing finding essential properties, writing proofs that are as short and elegant as possible, and being really clear about the scope of what you're studying so you don't make assumptions you don't need to. He even said, the axiomatization of theories has modified very deeply the style of contemporary mathematical writings.
Right. While Chevalier's work is interesting, it's not a complete theory of mathematical style. The encyclopedia suggests that's more of a job for philosophers of mathematics.
That makes sense. It leads us to this question of where exactly style lives in mathematics. Is it in the methods, the practices of groups of mathematicians, or maybe something even more fundamental? Where's the locus of style?
Javier de Lorenzo tried to build on Chevallier's work in his 1971 book, Introducción al Estilo Matemático. He listed a bunch of different styles, like geometric, poetic, algebraic, operational, and formal styles. But just like Chevalier, he didn't go too deep into explaining what makes up these styles from a philosophical perspective.
But the encyclopedia points out something interesting about both Chevalier's and De Lorenzo's work. The styles they talk about aren't tied to specific groups of mathematicians, but they're not universal either, like general scientific methods. They're somewhere in between.
Right. Jean Guéant, who studied style in the history of science, made a distinction between local styles, specific to certain groups or nations, and methodological styles, which are more like Ian Hacking's styles of reasoning, or Aleister Crombie's 6 styles of scientific thinking. Crombie's list includes things like axiomatic postulation, experimental exploration, hypothetical modeling, and statistical analysis.
And Guéant thinks those methodological styles might actually be more like fundamental methods of inquiry, not just styles in the way we've been talking about them in math.
Yeah, that's a good point. While historians of math are starting to use more local history approaches, using terms like epistemic configurations to describe how math knowledge is shaped within a community. Crombie's methodological styles haven't been used as much in math history, except for the axiomatic method. However, this new field of experimental mathematics might be showing us some new methodological styles within math, like experimental or algorithmic styles, as suggested by David Corfield.
So it looks like styles in math often fall into this middle ground. They involve specific methods and ways of approaching problems that go beyond just one community. But they're not as universal as those general scientific methodologies either. They're things like using direct versus indirect proofs, algebraic versus geometric methods, or conceptual versus computational approaches. That's the kind of stuff Chevalier and De Lorenzo were looking at.
Exactly. These intermediate styles are the ones that get talked about the most in mathematics, and they're different from how we usually think about style in the broader history and philosophy of science. As a philosopher, you might see some connections here to different schools of thought in philosophy, each with their own methods and ways of framing questions.
This brings us to a really big question. What's the epistemological significance of style in mathematics? Is it just about presentation, like a kind of coloring of math discourse? Or is it more connected to the actual content of math knowledge, even the objects themselves? This reminds me of Frege's distinction between sense and reference. It's like how we grasp an objective truth.
Yeah, that's a good connection. You have this one view which says that stylistic elements are basically just superficial, maybe reflecting a mathematician's personal preferences or the conventions of a community, but not actually affecting the core truth or content of the math itself.
But then the encyclopedia presents two more interesting positions. Granger's, which seems to align with a realist perspective, and Hacking's, which is explicitly anti-realist.
So let's start with Gilles Gaston Granger. He wrote an essay of a philosophy of style, where he lays out a pretty comprehensive theory. He sees scientific practice, including math, as this process of constructing abstract models. For Granger, style is really important in how we impose structure on experience. And in math, this experience goes beyond just the physical world. Math activity for him is what creates both the form and the content of math knowledge.
And he uses the example of introducing complex numbers in different ways using trigonometry, vector operators, or matrices. He's showing how different styles can capture the same math structure, but they can also shape our intuition and the directions we might take to develop or apply that structure.
Right. Granger argues that style is how we introduce and connect concepts, giving us a unifying framework. And it also shapes the role that intuition plays in our understanding. The underlying math object might be the same, but how we understand it and how we might use it in the future can be influenced by the style we choose. The encyclopedia suggests that Granger's view is at least compatible with realism, that these math objects really exist, even though his philosophy might have had some Kantian influences too. For him, style is how we come to understand those realities.
Okay, now let's look at Ian Hacking's idea of styles of reasoning. He sees this as really important for the history and philosophy of science, especially for explaining how we develop objectivity. And he's definitely against realism.
Yes, Hacking's perspective is pretty radical. He says that before we develop a specific way of reasoning, there aren't any sentences that can be true or false, and there aren't any objects for those sentences to be about. For him, styles of reasoning actually create new types of objects: evidence, sentences, truth conditions, laws, possibilities, classifications, and explanations.
So for hacking, style isn't just about presenting existing math truths. It actually helps define what those truths are and what the math objects are in the first place. That's a really strong constructivist position.
Exactly. He doesn't think math objects exist independently of the ways we think about them. And while hacking hasn't focused a lot on specific examples from math history, his work on constructivism in math definitely fits with this idea of style being really fundamental. It's a very different view from traditional realism in math.
So we've gone from these early historical observations to those grand cultural theories, from nationalistic views, both good and bad, to mathematicians reflecting on their own styles, and finally to these deep philosophical questions about mathematical knowledge itself.
We've seen that style in math is this complex idea with a long history. It's been used to describe everything from cultural influences to really specific choices about methods. And as we've discussed, those stylistic choices might not just be about presentation. They could really shape how we understand, maybe even create, the objects we study in mathematics.
And for you, our listener, I think this exploration of math style offers a new way of thinking about some of the big questions in philosophy. As a philosopher, thinking about these different perspectives, the historical development, the cultural influences, the cognitive implications, and maybe even the ontological dimensions can help us understand math in a whole new light. It makes us question the relationship between math and human thought and culture in a really interesting way.
We've just scratched the surface here. What parts of this conversation really stood out to you? Do you see connections between mathematical style and the way philosophical styles or schools of thought have developed? How might thinking about style help us make sense of how math has changed and how diverse it is?
Those are great questions to think about. And here's one last thought. Could the dominant style of math in a certain time period or community give us clues about the deeper philosophical beliefs or assumptions of the people doing the math? Maybe the way we do math, the style we choose, is not as objective and separate from our intellectual and cultural world as we might think.